Hi, Workplace Math 10 students. Today we're going to be looking at how to use the cosine function. So very similar to what we were just talking about with the sine function last assignment, but now using the cosine function. So we'll just take a look at a few things here to get started. So first off, in your Google Classroom, you should see a new assignment. It's going to be called 7.2C, and it's going to be the Mathletics Cosine A assignment that you're going to be working on. So let's get into this. So basically the cosine function is similar concept to the sine function, and if you recall, we talked last day in the last couple of classes about three key terms in trigonometry. So the three different sides of a triangle are referred to as the hypotenuse, the opposite, and the adjacent. And once again, when we're looking at a particular angle that we know, always directly opposite of that is going to be the opposite side. And likewise, opposite of the 90-degree angle, that's this angle here, is going to be the hypotenuse side. So the side that is not opposite one of these two angles that we know is what we call the adjacent side. And so this is the cosine that we're looking at. So if you recall, there are three trigonometric functions. We looked more specifically at sine last day, and that's opposite over hypotenuse. Cosine is adjacent side length over hypotenuse, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. So remember once again the sort of acronym that we can use, SOHCAHTOA, to remember this. And for the cosine, it is A and H, which stands for adjacent over hypotenuse. So let's take a look at some examples that you're going to see in Mathletics, and let's work through how we would solve those. So looking at this question here, we see that that basically in this question, what we don't know is we don't know this angle right here, angle theta. So we don't know the unknown angle. And so what we know then are we know the two side lengths, and the one side length directly opposite the 90-degree angle is the hypotenuse, and that's 8. And then directly opposite this theta, we don't have that. But the other side length right here, this is what we were known as the adjacent. So the adjacent is 3 in this case. So the two side lengths that we know is adjacent and hypotenuse. And thinking about that acronym we know, then we know that Ka is going to work with adjacent and hypotenuse, and that we need to use cosine for this. So the way we could set this up is we can say the cosine of theta is going to be adjacent side length over hypotenuse side length. And then we just plug in what we know. So we knew that 3 was the adjacent, and we knew that 8 was the hypotenuse. So we put that into this fractional formula here. And then what we have to do is we have to try and get theta by itself. So we are going to essentially do the opposite of cosine, and the opposite of cosine is the inverse of cosine. So we're going to take the inverse of cosine and multiply that by 3/8, or find out what 3/8 of the cosine inverse of cosine is. So let's take a look at how we can do that using a calculator. So I'm just going to use my calculator here, my computer calculator, and I'm just going to clear this off. And so what I'm now looking for is I want to know what 3 divided by 8 is, and that would be this figure here. And then I'm going to take the inverse, in this case the inverse of the cosine function, and what I end up with is a value of 67.9756 and so forth, and that's going to be the degrees, the angle that we're looking at. So once again, if we look at this, we are going to see that the answer to this question is 67.9757 degrees. So hence why we got this answer here. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Now let's take a look at the next type of question. So in this case here, what we're looking for here is not an angle, but we are looking for a missing side length, this missing side length B. And what we know right now is we know the opposite from the 90-degree angle, so we know the hypotenuse, and that is 8. We also know the theta, and that is 62 degrees. So in this case here, where we are looking for not the opposite of this, because this would be the opposite side here, This would be opposite, but what we know and what we're trying to find out is the adjacent. So we are dealing with adjacent over hypotenuse where we don't know what adjacent is. So therefore, our adjacent is going to be the unknown side B. Our hypotenuse is going to be the known side that we're told is 88, and where cosine is going to be of the angle that we know, which is 62 degrees. Now, in order to solve this, what we have to do basically is we have to get B by itself. And we can do that in essence by multiplying both sides of this equation by 8. So we multiply both these sides by 8. What we end up with is we end up with these canceling out, and we have 8 times cosine of 62 on this side, and we have B over here. And now what we need to do to solve this, let's just take a look at our calculator. How do we solve this? Well, let me just bring in up our calculator here. So I'm going to bring up the calculator, and I'm going to clear. And so what we're looking at here is we are going to go and find out what the 62 cosine is. And it's, once again, this is not taking the inverse. We don't want cosine to the power of -1. We want just cosine itself. So this number is 0.4695 or so. And then we're going to multiply that by 8. And so we're going to end up with a value of 3.755, or rounded up 3.76. So if we switch back to that screen here, this is how we got this value, 3.7558, or in other words, 3.76. Now, let's just take a look at this using a slightly different looking calculator. So if we were to use this type of calculator, once again, this is similar to what you would see with your iPhone. And so the only real difference here is that instead of an I and B, an inverse function, we have a second function here. But once again, we are looking to figure out what the cosine of 62 degrees is and then multiply it by 8. So we're going to go 62, and then we're going to hit the cosine button because we don't need to take the second function in this case. And then we're going to multiply this by 8. And that was going to give us that same value. Now, one of the key things here with any iPhone calculator is that we need to be in degrees. So if it doesn't say rad down here and degrees up here, then we're in rads instead, and then we're going to get the wrong answer. So we want to make sure on that. So that's how we solve that using 2 different types of calculators. Now, let's take a look at the very last question, which is like this. So this question here, once again, we're looking for an unknown side, but this time the unknown side is the hypotenuse. It is directly opposite the 90-degree angle. And so the side that we do know in relation to this, because once again, in relation to this angle here, this is the opposite side, so therefore the angle that we do know is the adjacent side. And so what we know here is we know angle theta, which is 50 degrees, and we know the adjacent of theta, which is 3 degrees. And so if we plug that in, we have 3 as our adjacent, and what we don't know, D, is our hypotenuse, and we're trying to figure out the cosine of 50 degrees. And once again, we're using cosine because we're dealing with adjacent over hypotenuse. And so in this case here, though, in order for us to get D by itself, what we have to actually do is, it's in essence, we are going to be multiplying by D, both sides. And I'm just going to explain this to you algebraically, so hopefully it makes sense to you. We're going to multiply by D both sides. This will cancel out these 2 D's, and we have D times cosine of 50, but we want D by itself. So to get the cosine of 50 over on the other side, we would have to divide both sides now by cosine of 50. And so that's why we end up with, let me just write this on both sides, we're going to end up with cosine of 50 on both sides. And that's why we end up with 3 over cosine of 50, because these cosines cancel out, and we have 3 over the cosine of 50 degrees is going to be equal to D. So now how do we solve for that? Well, let's take a look again how we would do this. So what we're going to do is we're going to, using the calculator, we're going to basically need to take 3, and then we're going to need to divide this, and I'm going to use a bracket just to be clear on what we're doing here. So I'm going to divide this, 3 divided by, and I just think I hit something wrong there. So I'm just going to 3 divided by, and then I want to take 50, and I don't want to know what the inverse of cosine is. I want to know cosine itself. So 50 cosine, and then close the bracket. So basically what we're doing is 3 divided by this 0.642, which is going to result in a value of 4.667. Now, once again, this number, because it's the hypotenuse, is going to be longer than the adjacent side. It makes sense because the hypotenuse is always the longer side. So in this case here, what we're going to see is that the answer to this is 4.6672. And basically what we have here is we have our hypotenuse, which should always be the longest side, is in fact longer than the adjacent side. So that makes logical sense. That is the right answer. So hopefully that all makes sense to you. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, as always, please just email me. I'm available to Zoom even if to try and explain this more fully to you. Take care.